Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual field day as we explore what's going on in the Clear Creek Watershed Project. We've got a great agenda for you today. Thank you to everyone who's attended a previous Iowa Learning Farms virtual field day and for providing feedback via our email evaluation process. We really appreciate that. I'm Liz Ripley. I'm a conservation and cover crop outreach specialist with Iowa Learning Farms. We are based on campus at Iowa State University. And we were established in 2004, and our goal is to build a culture of conservation, working with farmers and landowners and researchers and conservation professionals to implement conservation practices that improve water quality and soil health while helping remain profitable. Our partners in doing so include the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, Iowa Department of Natural Resources, US EPA Section 319, Conservation Districts of Iowa, Iowa Farm Bureau, Practical Farmers of Iowa, GrowMark, Iowa Agriculture Water Alliance, Iowa Corn, and the Iowa Nutrient Resource Center. So without their great support over those years, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you to everyone, both those groups and beyond, who have helped keep us going and continue to tune into these great virtual field days. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get going here. Please do remain muted during the video and speaker presentations. I will invite you to unmute and ask questions following the presentation. And you're also welcome to submit at any time questions via the chat box. I just sent that invitation there to help you find that. So feel free to get those in there and I'll get those directed to our speakers today. Following today's event, you'll be receiving an email from Iowa Learning Farms with a brief evaluation to let us know what you thought of today's event. And it's just the start of the conversation, because also included in there will be a recording of today's presentation. So if you know of someone that was interested in attending and couldn't make it, feel free to share that link with them, as well as tune into all of our previous field days, also archived on our website and our YouTube channel. If you do return your evaluation and would like an Iowa Learning Farms neck gaiter, we'd be happy to send that to you. Just feel free to provide your mailing address and we'll get that mailed off to you. So today we have three great speakers joining us following the video presentation. We have John Rathbun, the Clear Creek Watershed Coordinator, and Johnson County landowners Pat and Burne Sippy. So without further ado, I'll play the video.
Hi, my name is John Rathbun. I'm the Clear Creek Watershed Project Coordinator. I work for the Clear Creek Watershed Coalition, which is a WMA located in Iowa County and Johnson County, Iowa. The watershed starts above Williamsburg, which most people know because of the outlet mall, but actually starts in a town called Conroy, which is north of Williamsburg. And it runs from Iowa County down through Oxford, Iowa, through Tiffin, Iowa, and empties into the Iowa River at Coralville. The governmental parts of the organization are, starting from the upper end, would be Iowa County, the Iowa County Soil and Water Conservation District, Johnson County, the Johnson County Soil and Water Conservation District, the cities of Oxford, Tiffin, North Liberty, Coralville, and Iowa City. The goals of the project are a couple, one of which is to increase awareness about the watershed in general, also improve the watershed. We're also currently looking at reducing flood impacts downstream and water quality as well. We're currently a part of the Iowa Watershed Approach. That's the funding that came through to Iowa back in 2016, I believe, and we were selected as one of the participating watersheds. Our watershed is about 66,000 acres. Like I said before, runs from Iowa County into Johnson County to Coralville. So we're at the Roseanne Sippy property, which is north of Oxford, and I was asked how these sites were selected. Major factor in the Iowa Watershed Approach project is that everything is voluntary, so participation is voluntary and projects or practices are voluntary as well. We met with the Sippys back at nearly the beginning, actually at the beginning of the project. I think Pat and David and Burne were one of my first visits. And we selected, they showed me 4 different sites that they wanted to do work on, and all 4 of them were ponds. The sites we went through evaluation, and they're all feasible for ponds, and so that went to the design process. When we were meeting out here with the engineer and the Sippys, we looked at the site where we're going to have the Fringe Wetland, and as we were talking through what could go on at that site, we talked about a pond being first and foremost as a priority, and then we also talked about possibly doing a wetland in the upper reaches of that pond. In the course of wetland investigations, we discovered that there were some wetlands that would be impacted by the pond project, and the engineer, remembering that the Sippys had mentioned an interest in wetlands, they decided to do the mitigation as a fringe wetland around the outside of the pond, in actually probably 90% of the pond's perimeter is going to have a fringe wetland. And you might be asking what a fringe wetland is. The easiest way to say that is it would be along the fringe of a pond, but this one is a shelf varying from probably 6 feet to 10 or 12, maybe 18 feet in some portions. And that's going to be situated so that that shelf is just above the normal pool of the pond. So the soil in that shelf will be saturated most of the time and will be inundated during rain events. So it'll rise up and submerge the plants that are in that fringe wetland, and then drop down over the course of the next few days as the level drains down. There is a water quality benefit of the pond and the wetland too. The water, as it comes into the pond from the upper reaches, which isn't that far away, there's actually a spring there that Pat might talk about. The spring was used for a wagon stop at one point in time back in the 1800s. That's our main source of water, but as the water comes down into the pond from the sides, it'll go through that wetland and be filtered as well. Plus there's added benefit of some, I think, nitrate removal from the wetland as the water drains down, and when the plants are uptaking nitrogen through the dry periods as well. So I mentioned before that the Sippys have 4 practices that we're going to be installing. We have 2 that are already installed east of here a little bit, and then this one, and then the one with the fringe wetland. The fringe wetland is the pond with the largest surface area, and one of the main goal of the Iowa watershed approach is to help reduce flooding, and we do that between the normal pool level and the difference between that and the spillway level, and that's measured in acre feet. The best way I've come to try and figure out what an acre foot looks like is if you go down to the local high school football field and you put a foot of water on it, and that practice on the other side of the road, the one with the fringe wetland, is going to hold about 8 1/4 acre feet after each rainstorm, if there's enough rain to fill that much. And all totaled, the Sippys, just by themselves in their little part of the world here, over any rain event, will be holding 14.2 acre feet. So that's 14 football fields an acre or a foot deep in water. They'll be holding up in the watershed and allowing that to come out slowly over the course of the next few days. In total, we're going to be installing 70 different practices throughout the watershed, and I estimate that it's going to be roughly 65 acre feet that'll be held back up in the watershed after any rain event of significance.
Hi, I'm Pat Sippy. This is my brother.
Burne Sippy.
We originally heard about this, the Clear Creek Watershed Project through the NRCS and had a chance to meet John, the coordinator. We went to a series of meetings about the effects of flooding, which were quite interesting and gave us lots to think about and aspects of flooding that we hadn't considered before. This pond in particular was an existing pond. It was built in the late or early 50s by my dad and uncle. It had outlived its useful life. It was quite silted in. You know, obviously farming practices have changed in 70 years. And we had talked about, you know, what we were going to do with this pond, and the watershed project came up, and so we were happy to get involved. It gave us a way to deal with the erosion that was happening here from the old spillway. It's given us a way to move forward with this and hold back water, considerably more water than it had been before. So we're thrilled to be able to participate.
Yes, we have been interested in conservation practices, especially our parents, my father, Francis, our father, Francis, and Roseanne, his wife, and we had started a forest on the other side of our farm, and he had started a prairie, and that was years ago in the 1990s, and those are doing quite well. And then we had slowly added more prairie to the farm as we lessened our cattle herd, and we finally got out of the cattle herd, and we are have a lot of prairie practices. And so this is kind of involved with the Conservation Reserve Program in that it gives us the high quality water that will flow into this this pond and help with flood control.
You know, flood control is, I think, an added benefit for us, one we hadn't certainly given much thought to previously, how it affects, we're on some of the highest ground in Johnson County here and really don't think about what flooding does to Coralville and Iowa City. You know, our folks, my mom is 91, she's still here at the farm, and they've always been interested in good conservation practices and have passed that on to us. It's the erosion control is probably what came to our mind first rather than flood control, but after these series of meetings, I can see how they both mesh together. It's a win-win.
The prairie practices are here have increased the wildlife a lot on our farm. We see deer and wild turkey and you know, hawks and owls and obviously rodents of all kinds and pheasants, and so that having access to water will help even more with the animals that are, you know, it helps nature, it helps us have a good practice here.
The majority of the farm is now in CRP. We at this point do not have any row crops. We are still making hay. You know, what happens with the CRP program will determine where we go in the future. This ground is eligible for CRP because it was cropland. You know, we have put in the tree practice. We have put in some pollinator. We've put in some of the mixed short and tall grass prairies for the safe acres, gaining ground for wildlife. We've kind of looked at the programs as they have become available, and you know, wetlands is kind of a hot topic lately. So having this fringe wetland at the pond over to the west is going to be an experience for us. I mean, we're looking forward to that. There aren't a lot of wetlands left in Iowa, and over there it's kind of a unique situation, I think, with there is a spring that comes down from our neighbors. That water pretty much flows through. That's not big, but water flows through there year round. Maybe not quite so much now because it's so dry, but it'll just be an enhancement over there, and something we weren't originally expecting because we didn't think there was wetland over there. So that was kind of a surprise, but in the end, it'll be a good surprise.
Oh, we do have some neighbors and friends that will hunt, obviously hunting for deer, and we have pheasant hunters and some turkey hunters. And so, you know, during the times when that's available, yeah, they will ask and do some hunting out on the various lands. We get people to stop by and always want to. They see that big pollinator in the background or that shortgrass prey behind us, and they're interested. So there is definitely lots of wildlife, and they're interested in hunting.
You know, when we had a cow-calf herd, and did that for many years, so the row crops was always sort of a rotation of, hay, pasture, row crop. As we, our goals, rather changed, and the herd was reduced. Now we did have some tenants in here cropping ground. We certainly looked at the CRP programs as they became available, not probably as financially advantageous to be in CRP, but for us, I think we were happier putting it in the natives and doing the tree planting on what is some very hilly ground. And I think that we're going to leave this farm better. What happens in the future will depend on what happens with CRP. But yeah, we would like to keep it in grasses and forbs if we are able.
Pat mentioned that this is hilly ground, and we did have row crops here, though. That field behind us, the pollinator, is actually a very good field. It has a good CSR rating, and it for years was going into corn, soybeans, and then into alfalfa. We would rotate around that. But some of these other fields are a little more hilly, and they're mostly for cow pasture, but farmers do put those into corn or beans when they need to, or at least the tops of those. And so getting away from that practice, that creates a lot of erosion when you're going into fields that are a little too hilly. And that's the thing we like to see other farmers take out when they get a chance, take out something and use it for conservation. And some of our neighbors have done that, and that's really nice to see. There are fields that are better suited for corn and row crops, and then fields that aren't, that could do better with a conservation practice or some other practice. So it's nice to see. We felt it was important to move towards conservation, and yeah, like Pat said, it's not always as financially advantageous, but it's something our parents really thought was important, and we do too.
All right, so at this point, John has a little bit more information to share about the watershed project, so I'll turn it over to him.
Hi, thanks, Liz. Good afternoon, everybody. Really appreciate you attending our Clear Creek Field Day. And I'd like to thank especially all of our landowners and most especially the Sippys for participating in the program and being such great conservationists and being such good sports about being on TV. Okay, let's see. Well, that's interesting. Just a moment. I always see people having difficulties with this. Now I know why. Okay. I'm having some difficulty here. Oh, there you are. Okay. Oh, you're small over in the corner. Okay. Sorry about that. Now I really feel for people that have had this struggle like this. Okay. Are we live?
You are. You look great.
All right. Oh, that's excellent. Thanks for bearing with me on that one. So our watershed is located in Iowa and Johnson counties. This is a list of our partners. All of our partners have been really great to work with. Just really, it's been an incredible experience. Everybody has been as helpful as anybody could hope for. And especially, like I said, the landowners have been awesome to work with as well. Little location information for us is we're in Iowa County and Johnson County. About 40% of the land area is in Iowa County. We're a total of about 66,132 acres. The gold star up here is the subwatershed that we're going to talk mostly about today. A little overview of what our land use is, or land cover. We're about 60% row crops, 17% urban. We've got Oxford, which isn't very urban, but I think still counts. And we've got Tiffin, North Liberty, Coralville, and Iowa City. And the Clear Creek empties into the Iowa River right about here. It's just a little bit downstream of the Iowa River Power Company Dam. About 15% of the overall acreage is in alfalfa hay and grassland, and 7% is forested. This is our little sub-watershed. It's about 1,850 acres. Like both Pat and Burne said, it's pretty hilly. We've got about 2/3 that's going to be a slope C or greater. We've even got about 0.5% of area that's a G slope. And because of that, the row crop usage is lower than, like, say, the upper parts of the watershed. We've got about 45% row crop, 37 hay, alfalfa, and grass. So there's a fair amount of cattle that are grazed in this sub-watershed, and about 10% forest. Here's some pictures of the Sippy's ponds that are within that watershed. The one with the fringe wetland is just to the west from across the road from the home place. I kind of lucked out. I was looking at Google Maps as I was putting together this presentation, and they had done a satellite image last fall after the projects had been completed. So it was pretty cool to be able to have some real high altitude aerials here. So this is the pond that we shot the video at. We were located up here by the white pines and the beehives there. And you can see the area that gets hayed here, and above that is the CRP pollinator, I believe it is. And it's a pretty sizable dam height-wise. The other two ponds are just to the east of the home place. There's this little pond here, which is this picture. It's an aerial that was shot by the Flood Center folks. Thank you very much. And then this pond here, which looks kind of small from this angle, but really isn't. It's the larger of the two ponds. Here's the dam for that. And both of these have water hydrants that are gravity fed. They're going to use it for cattle if that ever becomes a factor, but for also managing burns when they do CRP burns. It's funny, this small pond, I say small because it always looked small. I think it's less than an acre, or just about an acre. Looking at all the plans, and then I walked out over the crest of this hill one day after it was finished, and it's not so small when it's on the ground. These three ponds total have a drainage area of about 68 acres with about 6 acre-feet of temporary storage during high storm events. Now, this next project is interesting. This is east of the Sippy residence, and this landowner has an active cattle operation. This is all pasture area up here. And he's got 3 ponds that are nestled one against the other, and a water and sediment control basin. So almost all of this pasture area is going to be treated by one practice or the other. You might notice that there's these little white dots below each of the dams. That's a gravity-fed watering system for his cattle. And these are pictures from the ground of the different dams. This dam is the middle dam. This is the upper one, and of course, this is the one over here. And this is that last landowner's brother, and this property is a little bit north and east of the Sippy property. This is interesting because that's kind of a nested situation. There's the larger pond, and then above it is a smaller pond. And this is all pasture area too. He has cattle actively out grazing there too. And this upper pond is meant to capture water coming off of the neighbor's property from the east. Hopefully, if there's any sedimentation that comes off of those fields, it'll get captured in this pond and not come into the lower pond. He has a gravity-fed watering system here. On the larger pond, though, since we snugged it up against the property line as close as we could, it didn't seem to really make sense to put a gravity feed water system down below that. So he opted to go with a watering ramp, and that's located up here where the cattle will go in, drink their fill, and then go back out. These two ponds have about a 22-acre drainage area, and they'll hold about 5 acre-feet of temporary storage. This lower pond should be full most of the time because he has some spring activity in this area. So we're confident it's going to be good for him and the watershed and the cattle. This last slide is the Sippy Pond with the Fringe Wetland. And in the video, I said 90%. When I look at the plan, it's somewhat less than 90%, but that's how my memory goes these days. We're keeping some of the original wetland up here. The contractor's directed to stay away from that. And then you can see here is the old dam that was breached a number of years ago. So this hasn't held water for some time now. And the new dam is going to create a much larger ponding area. The spillway is in red because we moved it from this side to this side. There's larger timber over on this side, and we decided that we'd want to save more of that than we had originally looked at. This has an 87-acre drainage area and will temporarily impound about 8 acre-feet of storage. This here is a little section view of what the fringe wetland is to look like. It's, like I said in the video, a little bit above the permanent pond level, and it will actually slope toward the pond a little bit. So that'll be saturated and inundated when we get rain. Hopefully the wetland seeding will take really well. There is some reed canary grass around here, so there's going to be a little bit of a battle with that. Hopefully a lot of it's going to get excavated out and we won't have to worry about it, but there still will be, I think, some seed bank. And that's the end of my slides. I shot this photo on a little field trip when I got started as a project coordinator. And this is my first chance to use it. I thought it was perfect for questions.
Well, thanks,
Thank you,
John.
Everybody.
Yeah. And Pat and Burne, if you want to go ahead and unmute and turn on your cameras. Again, if you have any questions for any of our speakers here today, feel free to either unmute or submit those via the chat box. I do have a couple questions that have come in. First up, so John, this one's for you. What are the barriers to expanding your watershed work? Are you successfully able to access state WQI money?
We certainly would be able to access the normal WQI dollars that everybody has access to. We have not looked into a grant to do a WQI watershed at this point. This year, I'm actively looking at different options to continue our work in the watershed. Probably won't be a FEMA funded project in the future. That's seems to not be matching up right now, but we'll see what happens. We're looking at a couple of different options though.
And someone was curious, you mentioned that you're going to be planting around the fringe wetland. What species are going to be in that mix as you seed around that wetland?
Oh boy. I know that arrowhead's going to be one of them. We're going to have rushes and sedges. The mix was actually put together by a representative from the Tallgrass Prairie Center. So we've had actually a lot of help from them. We've got some other projects that are going to have large plantings of prairie and some smaller wetlands that they've worked on as well. They've been a big help.
So I noticed in our previous conversation as we were planning this, you mentioned that one of the reasons why the fringe wetland construction hadn't started was for some wildlife considerations. Could you talk about a little bit about that and how that impacted the timeline for some of your projects?
Yeah, we had 2 endangered species that are areas of concern in this part of Johnson County. One is kind of all of eastern Iowa, which is bats, and that was probably the main difficulty in getting started a little bit sooner. The bid for this pond was let last, I think early March, or the contracts were signed in mid-March, so they only had a couple of days that they would be able to drop trees to stay out of the window of bats starting to move in. So that was the biggest slowdown. We also have rusty patch bumblebee in this area, which means that the contractor has to keep the area mowed down so that there's no forage material for the bees. And that was another consideration. We had that in the bid package. And then there's the bird nesting season as well. So contractors had to kind of fit into a fairly tight window, but it's certainly doable.
And speaking of bees, Pat and Burne, I saw that there were some beehives in and around where we were filming that day. What's your plan with those?
Well, I'm a novice beekeeper. I took a class. Now my bees did not make it through the first winter. So I'm going to have to start again, but I thought that was a nice location. They've got the shade from the white pines there. So they're covered from the heat of the sun, and then there'll be a water source. So I'm hoping to start up again, but right now, and it's right next to the pollinator that we put in. So they should have plenty of food, but we want to get through this last project with the wetland. I'm not going to start up again this year, but next year for sure.
Great. So what's the anticipated completion date on that fringe wetland then? I don't know if that's better suited for Pat and Burne or John.
Hey, John, why don't you help us out here? Timeline. What's the deadline approaching that?
I believe he has all the bat trees taken care of this year. That's correct?
He's getting all the trees down. He has started, and he's going to get them all by April 1.
So that helps a lot. We should be able to get construction pretty well completed this spring if the weather cooperates, and if not, we're
hoping.
I think they mentioned that.
Yeah.
They're hoping for May, late May maybe. I don't know. They're hoping to get there. So.
Unless it's super wet this spring, that he, even Bryce said he's ready to jump right on it.
And someone's curious, you mentioned taking down all those trees. What's the plan for those trees?
They'll get burned.
Okay.
Unless Pat and Burne want to harvest some for firewood.
Most of them are smaller trees. There's a couple older, there was a couple dead, large cottonwood or two, but all the ones on the fringe wetlands are still pretty immature. I mean, they're not fully grown trees. They're 20 or 30 years old, and so they're not huge. So they're not worth any much.
And since nobody's really looking for firewood after the derecho because there's plenty of it around.
Fair, yes. So, John, you showed a lot of pictures from your various projects. What happens to all that fill or the soil that's excavated to create all those ponds?
Most of it gets used up in the creation of the dam. Anything that doesn't, which I don't think has been a problem at this point, would get spread out. They first peel off the topsoil and stockpile that so that they can respread it over the subsoil that they uncover to do the final seeding. But most of it's been getting used in the dam construction.
So any future projects in the works besides the Fringe Wetland? What are some of the other projects going on in the watershed?
Oh, we've got quite a few that are going to be happening this year. This spring also, we expect we're going to have several projects that are going to get completed in Iowa County. Those are going to be a lot of water and sediment control basins and a few grassed waterways. And then hopefully this spring, we're going to be letting some other ponds. We've got, I think, 4 ponds left. And then we've got 4 or 5 different wetlands that we're going to be building, mostly on the smaller size, less than an acre. Nothing like a crepe water or nothing like a crepe wetland. And we're doing several floodplain reconnection projects. We're doing 3 for Coralville and 1 for a private developer in Tiffin. So we've got a pretty good variety of projects going on over the course of this next year.
So someone's curious, obviously it varies, if you've got a project going on or not, but in general, what kind of cost share is available to restore silted in ponds built in the 50s, much like the Sippys were doing during that video?
I don't know if there's any regular source of restoring ponds like that. I think part of it is because there's not a resource concern at that point. We were fortunate because our resource concern is flooding, and if we were able to increase the capacity of a pond, then we found it was feasible.
So potentially head into your local NRCS office, see if they've got any options for you, and take a look. Maybe there is potential to increase storage capacity and help with that as well.
Yeah.
Curious here, what role have the downstream communities played in the building of your watershed community? You have a unique watershed, as we've done multiple with the Iowa Watershed Approach projects. Yours has one of the larger urban components to it.
Yeah, the downstream folks have been actually very active. The city of Coralville was kind of the impetus for creating the Watershed Management Authority, the coalition we call it, because we don't really have any authority. But they're the ones that suffer most obviously from flooding. But that's not to say that somebody that lives in the rural part of the watershed doesn't suffer from flooding as well. I got some numbers from Iowa Homeland Security a number of years back, and damage to road crossings and gravel roads are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, as well as parklands that are located next to waterways. So really, when there's flood damage, everybody suffers, and sometimes it's a matter of having to drive an extra hour or so to get to work if you're working off farm. But one thing I want to say about Coralville as well is they've been very active in trying to reduce stormwater running into streams, et cetera, for a number of years. They're kind of one of the leaders in the state for doing green infrastructure projects like rain gardens and biocells.
And Pat and Burne, you mentioned it a little bit in the video, how your neighbors have started to change maybe some of their land use. What are some of the questions your neighbors have asked, or have they approached you at all about what you're doing with these projects?
A couple we've had a couple neighbors ask what we would do, and obviously you see big equipment driving around, and you really can't see any of these projects from the road. So they've just been curious about what we were doing, and we've been happy to explain and tell them how we got involved in this, and let them know to contact John. I mean, I think this particular window has closed for this funding, but it's when it was available, that's where we sent people, because they, people do wonder what's going on, as neighbors do.
We had a neighbor who does a lot more corn than us, and heard that he is putting in pollinators, which we had put in the pollinator, and it was good to hear that he was adding some, because he has some land that's not very croppable, and he decided to do that, and that's great. And he is also the ones that was putting in the ponds over there along Highway 6. He
for cattle.
Cattle, but also for storm control.
So someone's curious, this is a great project, a lot of available funding for these projects. If you're willing, how much, if any, of the costs were out of pocket for the landowners in these project areas? Or Pat and Burne, if you want to talk about your role in that, feel free to chime in as well.
Well, when this, and I think John, could maybe speak better to this than I could, but I think when this originally started, the cost share was, our portion of it was 25%. And I'm not sure what happened, but they did find more money, or I don't know, somebody else stepped in and lowered our responsibility of our percentage of it. So, I mean, it was a great opportunity, and we were kind of figured it was a once in a lifetime to do something that we had already been talking about.
Yeah.
And, we went all in.
Yeah. It was a chance, the opportunity, and and even though it cost us out of pocket, it's part of this conservation. It's like part of what helps the wildlife and the conservation that happens on our land. And that pond was just eroding and dumping silt and stuff. It was only going to get worse, so it was a good chance to get that taken care of.
So we were thrilled to participate.
Like Pat said, the original funding cost share was going to be 75%, and the landowners were going to kick in 25%. But the IWA got together and thought that we might get better results from offering a 90-10% cost share. The Sippys had told me a number that they were comfortable with in the very beginning. So what wound up happening is they were able to do more ponds than we thought initially. We thought we might be able to do a couple. And then when the cost share changed, they thought they were interested in doing another one or two. The interesting thing about this cost share, it's different than state cost share and most of the federal cost share in the sense that we have an engineer that we contracted with who developed the plans and developed a estimated cost of each individual practice, and we made that the cost share amount. So they paid 10% of that. So if there was a cost overrun, they didn't have to worry about coming up with extra money. The project takes care of that. So there's a lot of security for the landowner in that sense.
And someone is curious, while we're on this funding discussion, besides the Iowa Watershed Approach funding, has there been any other funding sources involved with the implementation of practices within your watershed project?
There's a grant that one of the members of the Flood Center won a couple years back through the EPA, and they're kicking in some funding for some projects that'll help specifically with water quality. So that's about $150,000. They're actually, last I knew, they were also going to fund a fairly sizable oxbow project just south and west of Kent Park.
And then someone's curious, there's anticipated flood storage, but what kind of monitoring or assessments are being done to evaluate the effectiveness of these practices?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can't do the math. Fortunately, we've got the Flood Center as a integral partner, and we're reporting all of the projects or practices that we get installed on the ground, and they've already got their modeling set up. They're going to plug all of those structures into their modeling, and they're going to calculate what kind of change we're going to be making with the practices that would get installed. And they're doing that for all of the IWA projects.
So you mentioned a few times that there's folks that also had ponds and they're putting in the gravity waters. How do those work, and what kind of maintenance agreements do these producers have to sign?
Yeah, there's they work by, you can't see my hand now, you can. There's a pipe in the inside of the pond, and that gets situated in different locations depending on the pond project. And then there's a pipe below the dam, so it's lower. So the pressure from the pond above the upper pipe presses down and forces water down through the system. And they've got it there's two different setups for the folks in our watershed. One is just a regular, what you would consider a hydrant that every farm has. And then they either run a hose to a tank or just have it left out and ready to fill whatever they want to fill when they want to fill it. And the other one is, it's got like a valve system in a tank down below, and when the cattle drink water, it slowly goes down, and then it turns on the valve and it fills back up. And there's no electricity involved in that. It's just like a flush toilet sort of float valve strip.
And then maintenance agreements.
Yeah, the maintenance agreements, there's nothing specific for the watering system, but for the structures themselves, there's a 20-year maintenance agreement.
And someone's curious, what have been some of the effective outreach and education strategies you've used in Clear Creek or other watershed projects? I know you've worked with a few others that you feel has been effective with landowners.
Well, we had kickoff meetings. There was an initial kickoff meeting that I wasn't in attendance to, where they talked about the project as a whole and sort of, 30,000 foot level. And I think that generated a lot of interest. And then once I had all my ducks in a row and paperwork put together and had my head wrapped around the project, we had two different kickoff meetings for the landowners. We did two, one in each county. I wanted to get them at least as close to the people that were going to probably be attending and not try and show any favoritism toward one county or the other. And those were really well attended. We had some food that was, the monies for that were donated by local banks and Farm Bureau, et cetera. Those went pretty well, I think. I'm kind of old fashioned in the sense that I sent postcards out for a lot of our announcements, and I'd use a postcard that would be the size of a half sheet of paper to hopefully get it to stand out a little bit. And we've been doing newsletters as well for outreach. We had an interesting outreach, a couple of events. We didn't have one this last year because of the pandemic, but the first 2 years I was project coordinator, I thought it'd be interesting to have a picnic, not to give anybody any sort of spiel or talk or anything like that, just to get together as neighbors and hang out and eat. And the first one was, I thought, fairly well attended. If you're just counting numbers, maybe not. It was, I think, 8 different folks. But what I found really interesting was they came early and they stayed late. And there was a lot of discussion and probably some friendships that got developed from there. And then the following year, we kind of got rained out, but we had it anyway. And we had six or so people show up. That was good too. So that was probably the most different sort of outreach that we've done. I hope to continue it again this summer.
I think we all are excited to get back and have those informal conversations face to face again soon. I guess I might pitch this question to Pat and Burne. You mentioned attending a meeting. What outreach worked for you all?
I thought that maybe the most interesting one that I went to was the man that came from the flood center, and I'm sorry, but I don't remember what his name was, but he had he talked about flooding in Coralville, you know, over the years, and he had photos that they have access to show how it had increased, and also who is most likely to be living in flood zones and most affected by this. And it's definitely the least advantaged people, which I just hadn't really given that any thought. It just kind of opened up a whole nother line of thinking for me.
Yeah, like she had said, we're up here where it's high, and even when we had the big floods, the fields just get wet, but we are not close enough to any major waterway that's going to flood us directly. So it just gets wet up here. But it's nice to see that meeting at the Coralville Public Library. Was that?
The Coralville with the that was a different one.
Oh yeah, but that was very interesting, just seeing what Coralville, all the plans that they're trying to do to improve nature and improve things around the Clear Creek. They're part of Clear Creek, and all the projects they're trying to do to like make things better for just recreation and and also for conservation.
Right, and taking these wet areas that they're now moving away from building on and turning them into trails and frisbee golf and giving bicycle and making use of these areas. And they've done a lot of planting with wetland species and trees that can take wet and making it available to the public. I had no idea that was even there, and we don't live that far away from Coralville, so there's always something to learn. Keep your ears open.
Yeah, meetings are very
the
good
meetings were
information.
great. Well, I too will be glad to get back to being able to to attend something.
Well, great segue here, because we do have some more virtual meetings coming up, but we hope to return to in-person later this year as well. So feel free to keep those questions coming in. I'm going to share my screen one more time. So if you attended today for a CCA credit, here's the information you need. I'll also put this in the chat so you can easily access my email. Be sure to get that to me by 5 o'clock today, and I'll get that submitted so you get your credits. And we have another virtual field day coming up in 2 weeks. Do note that we have daylight savings time coming up, so that'll be at 1 p.m. And we'll be improving water quality through stream stabilization in the east-west Nishnabotna River. So we'll be heading over to southwest Iowa and the Lost Hills region to see what they're doing over there to help with water quality and flooding control as well. So if you have any last questions, feel free to get those in. And again, you'll be getting an email with this recording and letting us know what you think following today's presentation. So thank you everybody for tuning in today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now get out and enjoy this nice weather.